Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight to talk about what the new immigration bill could mean for you. My name is Caitlin O'Shaughnessy, and I'm a senior attorney at Murray Osorio. And I'm here with one of our partners, Simon Sandoval Moshenberg. And we are going to do a little bit of a Q&A about the Senate Supplemental Funding Bill. So, Simon, can you give us an idea of what the Senate Supplemental Funding Bill is?
Sure. Thanks, Caitlin. It's great to be here with you this afternoon. So before anything else, I'm going to preface this by saying today's the 7th of February. It's noon.
Yeah.
The information we're giving you is relevant as of the time at which I'm speaking. But when it comes to legislation, it's a fast-moving process, and things can change both in terms of big picture and in terms of details from one moment to the next. So again, the information we're giving you is accurate as of noon on the 7th of February. But what's going to happen from there is anybody's guess. And the one thing that is certain is that this is going to have huge effects on the immigrant community in the United States, especially future immigrants to the United States. So what's going on right now is that there's a bill being debated in Congress. It's in the Senate first. If it passes the Senate, it has to go to the House of Representatives. But President Biden has indicated his strong support for this bill. So even if it doesn't pass as a piece of legislation, it's still important to understand what's going on and what's being debated, because this generally represents sort of the Biden administration's take on future immigration and future asylum seekers in general. So even if this bill doesn't pass, which is looking less and less likely that it will pass, aspects of this bill could very well and probably will very well show up in one form or another over the next several years, both in future legislation, but also in future executive actions by the Biden administration.
Right. And so, as you're saying, to clarify, if anyone's still confused, this is a bill, it's not a law, and it still needs to be voted on to pass. And what you're saying is we're hearing that it doesn't look that likely to pass. Fingers crossed.
No, I mean, we'll see over the next few days what happens with this bill, whether or not it's on its way to become a law. But it really is one of the most radical proposals to changes to future immigration on the U.S.-Mexico border, especially with regards to the asylum process for people who come to the United States seeking asylum. So it's really important to understand what's being proposed, even if it doesn't get enacted at this time.
Right. And the bill does have a lot of changes to the asylum process. So before we talk about those, would any of them affect people who are currently in the United States?
So the good news is that the answer to that question is no. As the bill is currently proposed, it really only affects people who would be coming to the United States to seek asylum after the date in which President Biden would sign it into law. So for people who are already here and who have already filed an asylum application, whether they filed it with USCIS or whether they filed it with the immigration court, and they're waiting for their asylum application to be processed, this wouldn't affect them. This would not affect them.
Good to know. And so what changes would it make for people who are arriving at the border and want to seek asylum?
There's some really big changes proposed for folks who are arriving at the border, who will arrive at the border seeking asylum. And we know that this is important even to folks who are here because, we all have family members who are maybe even in the process of making the journey to the United States or who are thinking about making the journey to the United States. So it's really important to know these proposed changes. So first of all, there's a change to the sort of initial threshold standard. Right now, if you come to the border seeking asylum, in order to have access to the asylum process, in order to even be allowed to go into court to state your claim for asylum, you have to pass an initial screening interview called a credible fear interview. Not with a judge, it's with an asylum officer, although you have the right to a review by a judge. And this is not where you prove your asylum claim. It's really supposed to be just like a very low threshold, sort of to see whether you even have an asylum claim at all. And then if you pass that, it doesn't mean you get asylum. It means that the courthouse doors are open to you. And if you fail that, and if you fail the review, the courthouse doors remain closed and you get removed. Well, one of the things that this bill would do is really raise the threshold standard for that initial interview. So it would make it a lot harder for asylum seekers to even get to the point in the process where they're allowed to even request asylum. So that's sort of big change number one.
Mm-hmm.
Number two is with regard to the overall procedure for asylum. Right now, if you pass that credible fear interview, which again is right now is a pretty low standard, then you get, the doors of the courthouse are open, you get to go into court, you get to go in front of a judge. The judge will decide your case in court. And if the judge denies your case, you have the right to appeal to what's called the Board of Immigration Appeals. And if the Board of Immigration Appeals denies your case, you can take the case into federal court in front of a federal judge. Well, this bill would do away with all of that.
A lot of it, or all of it, right?
It would say that for people who are coming to the border seeking asylum, and people who request asylum immediately off of an airplane, right,
Mm-hmm.
when they're still like at the airport in the, you know, customs and immigration section, they would not have the right to go before a judge at all. All of this would be handled administratively. The appeal would be a new sort of administrative appeal. And if all of that is denied, there would be no right whatsoever to take it to federal court. So it would really, they do this in order to speed up the process considerably. So even if you make it through that higher full standard, that higher interview for the initial interview,
Mm-hmm.
and you get into full proceedings, the full proceedings aren't in front of a judge anymore, and you don't have the right to that backstop of judicial review in a federal court. Right now, judicial review in a federal court is really practically, in some cases, the only thing that makes any of this fair, because people get railroaded by the system, but then finally they get their day in federal court in front of a real judge. This would take that away if it were passed into law.
So it sounds like this is really stripping away a lot of the protections that currently exist in an attempt to maybe speed things up, but that it would come at huge expense to asylum seekers.
That's exactly right. It's death by 1,000 cuts, and it would make it much more difficult to obtain asylum by coming to the border or landing at an airport and requesting an asylum at the border or at the airport.
And so I know that you already mentioned that this won't affect people with pending asylum claims who are in the United States, but what about those people who are already inside the US, but they want to apply for asylum? Will this affect them in any way?
I think it certainly possibly might. And I think that folks who are right now in the United States and considering applying for asylum should really get a consult with an immigration lawyer as quickly as possible for two reasons. One, generally speaking, even without this new law, you've only got 1 year to apply for asylum, right?
Yes.
You have to apply within 1 year of arriving in the United States. And that doesn't mean you can show up at the lawyer's office at 362 days after you arrive and somehow think the lawyer's going to manage to make it work. But the other thing is that I talk to a lot of people who sort of have the attitude of like, well, I missed the year, so now I'm screwed. There's nothing I can do about it. That's also not true. Under the current law, there are exceptions, but those exceptions require you to move quickly, right? And so even if you've sort of blown past that 1 year deadline for whatever reason, it is important to try to move as quickly as possible to get that asylum application filed. You want to make sure that whatever happens in Congress, whether it's this bill, whether it's some other form of this bill, whether it's some other bill entirely, you want to make sure that your application is decided under the law as it exists today, right? Not under some future law, which is undoubtedly the way things are going to be worse, right? No one's talking about making the law better right now for asylum seekers.
Yeah. It's not going to get easier.
Right. And we haven't even talked about what is sort of making the most news or the most headlines about this new proposed bill, which is the border shutdown authority. All the things I said about the tougher initial screening and the the administrative process without any review by a judge, Even that is going to be subject to this shutdown authority, whereby essentially if there's too many people crossing the border in any one day, the president can just sort of unilaterally say, forget it, we're done, no more. We're not going to take any more asylum claims. Come back and try again in a month. And that's very, very similar to what we had under Title 42. If you remember, during the pandemic, a lot of people who were crossing the border were just sort of summarily bussed right back to the other side. And they weren't even allowed to do that initial asylum interview. They weren't even allowed to state a claim for why they're afraid. They were just picked up and bussed right back to the Mexican side of the border. And a lot of people did that over and over again because there was no sort of legal consequence. Well, it would make that permanent, right? This thing that was like a pandemic emergency measure would make it permanent, a permanent part of U.S. immigration law. And it would say, if you do that twice, you've got a negative consequence of a whole year of being inadmissible to the United States. So it really took something that was an emergency measure and a very controversial. I'm not saying it was okay during COVID, but at least it was supposed explanation was COVID, and it would make it a permanent feature of U.S. immigration law, which is very, very difficult to swallow, and it'll make it really, really hard to even be allowed to access that initial asylum interview.
And it really creates an unfortunate situation at the border, because if people are prohibited from entering because there's been too many people that have come in before them, they're stuck, right? Like they can't get into the United States. It's not like they're going to go back to where they fled persecution. And I think that as we know, that leaves them in a really vulnerable situation to organized crime, cartels, just really bad living conditions south of the border. And I think that's something that often gets overlooked as well, because when people are so desperate that they're going to leave their country, it's not like just turning them away at the border is going to change that reality and incentivize them to go home either.
Yeah, it's going to create terrible conditions in Mexico.
Yeah.
If you stop up a garden hose, but the water's still flowing into the hose, sooner or later that hose is going to burst. And it's also going to create these really bizarre sort of incentives for people to try to cross at 12:01 a.m. People to try to cross on the first of the month. It's not going to solve any problems whatsoever, and it's just going to make life a lot harder for people who really need and deserve asylum in this country. Again, TBD. Very much, we'll see whether this becomes law or not. Maybe now, maybe later, maybe in some other form. Maybe some form of executive action if this legislation ultimately goes down, as a lot of pundits are predicting. I do want to point out a couple positive things in this bill, because I think those are also things that might end up going forward in some way, shape, or form, even if this particular bill goes down. There's sort of three things in this bill that I do want to pull out as positive developments in the law if they actually go through. And the fact that they were put into this bill does seem to indicate that there's some sort of legs, there's some sort of possibility that we might see them become into law sooner rather than later. So the first one is what's called the Afghan Adjustment Act. This would create a very straightforward path to a green card for nationals of Afghanistan who came into the country after July 30th, 2021. So a lot of those folks have applied for asylum. A lot of those folks have applied for TPS. A lot of those folks have applied to renew their parole. TPS and parole are very important. They get you a work permit. They get you to be allowed to stay here, but they're not a path to U.S. citizenship. Asylum can be a path to U.S. citizenship and is a path to U.S. citizenship when you win a case for asylum, but the system is so sort of overwhelmed that it can take years and years and years and years to get through. So the Afghan Adjustment Act, if it goes through in this bill or if it goes through in some other bill, would create a very straightforward administrative, file some paperwork with USCIS and you get a green card type of process. So that's really positive for Afghan nationals who came to the United States after July 30th of 2021. The second thing that's in this bill is a somewhat of an increase in green cards for family-based and employment-based petitioners, but not a huge increase. I think we really need a huge increase, but at least some increase. As we know, the backlogs, for example, in the family-based categories are just absurd, right? If you're a US citizen petitioning for your unmarried over 21-year-old child, it could be easily 10 years, right? And if they were to increase the annual numbers, then that 10 years could go down to 8, 7, 6. They need to increase the numbers quite significantly to eliminate the backlogs, but at least reducing the backlogs would help family unity. So hopefully that's another thing from this bill that's going to get sort of parceled off and might move forward in some other form. And then finally, the third thing that's in this bill that is a really positive development that hopefully we'll see in some form in the future is relief for children of H-1B visa holders. Sometimes these are called the documented dreamers. They're kids who've grown up here. Their parents are on these sort of renewable work visas, but the kids themselves, as soon as they turn 21, it's like, happy birthday, here's a beer, and here's a deportation order, right? Because their status expires on their 21st birthday. So this bill proposes to fix that by sort of creating a new category for children of H-1B visa holders who've lived here for 8 years. It's a long time, but 8 years before their 21st birthday. So hopefully, again, that's another proposal that even if it doesn't go forward in this bill, will go forward in some shape or form in the near future.
Yeah, so there are definitely positive parts of this bill, it sounds like, and it's just unfortunate that it's lumped in with so much problematic stuff. The other question I had for you was, how do you think this bill would change the parole process for the process for Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans, the CHNV program?
Yeah, that's been one of the very successful programs of the Biden administration in the past 3 years, is the Cuban, Haitian, Nicaraguan, Venezuelan, the CHNV parole program. We've managed to get a number of folks into the country who probably otherwise would have taken a dangerous trip through Mexico and across the border. And we've seen success stories of family reunification on the individual level. And on the sort of broader social level, there's evidence that program actually is reducing the number of illegal border crossings from people from those countries. Fortunately, this bill, as it's proposed, doesn't eliminate the ability to continue forward with those programs, because those programs are really important. But again, that's been a real lightning rod for controversy on Capitol Hill. And if you have a family member in one of those countries who's thinking about going forward with this process, I would really recommend getting started on it immediately for 2 reasons. One, the possibility of future legislation, and then 2, the possibility of a change in administration in 11 months, right? I mean, we don't know who's going to be president come January 21st next year. And one of the 2 candidates has really said that he's absolutely going to eliminate this program on day 1. So if you apply now, it should be enough time to get it through before, January of next year. But I would really get moving on that ASAP.
Yeah, so I think a couple of important takeaways from what you've said today is, if you're in the US thinking about applying for asylum, it's time to talk to a lawyer and get that moving. And if you might be eligible for one of those reunification processes, let's get it started for you now. So thank you so much for giving us all of that information about this new bill. Hopefully it does not pass in its current form. I would hope that the good parts of it, the Afghan Adjustment Act, the H-1B changes, will go through separately in the future, and that those big blows to the asylum system don't come through. Is there anything else that you think it's important for us to know about the bill?
Well, maybe not about the bill, but just sort of more broadly, I guess the last thing I'd say is, people can be frustrated when they come to you come to a lawyer and you want the lawyer to tell you what the law is, right? And of course, you come to an immigration lawyer, and the immigration lawyer can tell you what the law is right now, but they can't tell you what the law is going to be in 6 months, 12 months, 18 months. People get frustrated by that. And immigration really is sort of an area in which it's not enough to just open the law book and read the law and see what it says. You have to keep track of, agency practices, agency policies, what's going on, but you also have to keep track of, the front page of the daily newspaper in order to be able to advise your clients as to what might happen in the future, what they need to watch out for, right? So that they can sort of plan their lives around what's going on. And that's why it's so important to have a lawyer who's up to date on what's going on, not just with regards to actual changes in the law, but also potential changes in the law. A lot of times, a lot of people, for example, with the DACA program, I've met a lot of people who had always sort of planned to apply for DACA and hadn't gotten around to it yet. And then when all of a sudden, from one day to the next, a federal court in Texas sort of dropped the shutters on DACA intakes and said no more, they were left out in the cold. And, immigration is really an area in which you should never put off to tomorrow what you can do today.
I would absolutely agree with that. I think that's a really good point for us to end on. And for those of you watching the replay, you can leave comments on YouTube or Facebook, and I do my best to respond to all of them. And then, as always, you can call our office and schedule a consultation. And if you mention that you found us on YouTube, we will give you 50% off our consultation fee. So hopefully this was helpful to you, and we will be back again to talk about USCIS fee increases next week. Thank you very much.
Take care, Caitlin.